So just in case you do not want to be recorded. Other than that, please fill up the seats, because when Tom stands here, it's actually quite nice when he can interact with you. I'm super excited. Welcome, everyone. I'm glad that so many showed up, and feel free to continue eating the pizza, because it's late here. I'm super excited to have Tom with us tonight. Tom he's executive director at Epicenter Works, but more than that, he's been all around Europe, I think pretty much in every single country by now, campaigning for net neutrality, making sure that we actually have protection here in Europe, which for those of you who are tuning in from the States might not be, as happy news as it is here. But he's going to tell us a lot about how we actually got here in the European Union, why it's different, also why the debate is different, and what's going to come next. And the most exciting part for me, I'm super, super excited to be able to announce Tom is going to join us, is a senior fellow for Mozilla. And he's going to work exactly on the topic he's going to talk about tonight. So you'll have a chance to ask him lots of questions throughout the entire year. And he's going to be with us in San Francisco for the Fellows Week. So for those of you tuning in, make sure you say hi and ask him more questions. Diane, lovely Diane, is with us here in Berlin. So as usual, use our internal channels. On IRC, it's Mozilla, and on Slack, it's speakers-series. Post your questions. She's going to read them out later. And don't be shy. Have fun.
Thank you. So, hello everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, here in Berlin, and also watched in so many other places. In this talk, I want to give you a short history of the debate for internet protection, net neutrality protections in Europe. And it actually starts on a national level. In Europe, we had two countries that established national protections for net neutrality before this issue was raised on a European level. First, the Netherlands and then Slovenia established national laws that protected net neutrality, and they were quite early on with that. And of course, you always had progressive forces that were asking for protections for net neutrality. The whole debate in the US was reflected heavily here, particularly in the digital rights community. And then in the European Parliament, you had 4 non-binding resolutions that were calling for legal protections for net neutrality. But it took us till 2013 till the European Commission proposed a law. I'm going to spare you the details about European policy making, but just so you know, you have basically 3 players. You have the European Commission, which is the guardian of the treaties, and they are the only ones that can actually propose legislation. And then the parliaments of the directly elected representatives and the council, so to say, which consists of the 28 member states, the governments, which also decide and have a voice in there. And so what did we do as civil society? Back then I was just volunteer activist and was really deep into net neutrality. And when this whole issue was raised, the first thing we did when this law came out, we opened up a wiki page and started to write amendments, because what the Commission proposed was actually the opposite of net neutrality. It would basically allow all types of discrimination, and we really had to fight back a lot against what the Commission was originally setting out to do. And how do you do that? Of course, you can write stuff, but it's better to also engage people. And so with a small team in Vienna, together with European Digital Rights EDRI and the offices of Access Now in Brussels, we started safetyinternet.eu. And of course, we already had safetyinternet.com and the American campaigns in the back of our head, but then we also wanted to create something that is a pan-European campaign, and you will hear a little bit more about the differences and difficulties that we had to face there. And so we had our campaign. We already had a coalition of around 12 different NGOs from all different member states. And how do you get the attention of European parliamentarians? We actually used quite old technology. We started sending faxes. So you could just go to safetyinternet.eu and enter your message, press send, and then an actual physical fax would come out in the personal office of the MEP in the European Parliament. And the nice thing was, the fax machine was also the printer. And you could not disconnect the fax machine without also disconnecting the printer. And that means all those people that wanted to raise their voice for net neutrality had a physical token of their voice in the offices of their representatives. In total, we sent around 40,000 faxes. I'm still really sorry about the trees, but it worked. And that was the first iteration of the campaign. This is the second one, which we did for the final push. And back then I was already working in Brussels. I moved from being a volunteer and a programmer to becoming a digital rights activist, and was working as policy advisor for EDRI and also directly engaged with the parliament. Also, what's new in that stage is that we had, for the first time, street activism for net neutrality in Europe. This is a group called XNet that projected at the offices of Telefonica, the headquarters of Telefonica in Barcelona, the logo of Save the Internet. We succeeded in the first reading of the parliament and actually got quite good, solid rules for net neutrality at that stage. But then the debate moved on to the council. So suddenly we had to deal with 28 member states. That means officials from governments which are not directly accountable. There are no protocols and meetings from these negotiations, so it's really hard to have transparency and have a debate. But still, we actually, over a very, very intense campaign and a lot of lobbying, succeeded to at least land somewhere in between the Commission and the Parliament. So it was kind of one really bad, one really good, and one in between was the situation there. And I also want to inject something else here, topic-wise. We have talked a lot about managed or specialized services in Europe, and that's maybe obscure for other parts of the world, because it's really something unique that we spend so much time in Europe discussing managed or specialized services. What are these things? So it basically means an access to a telecom service which is not the internet. So think about a point-to-point connection between two hospitals or two research facilities, or telephony these days. Usually, if it is facility-based, is via a dedicated network, a VLAN, and therefore is not the normal internet, similar to television. And those are the normal specialized services. Net neutrality doesn't apply to them. That's also okay, but they can be quite tricky. So we heard a lot about these official examples, so that we need exceptions from net neutrality because of telemedicine, because we want to do a remote surgery over the internet, or that self-driving cars would require all-time network connection, which is just not true, because then you couldn't never go through a tunnel. And we had a lot of debate about these examples, which ate up a lot of the time we could spend on that. And in fact, what helps a little bit more to think about specialized services is this image, which is actually really from a Facebook video. So instead of a universal connection that allows you to plug into everything, every device to this thing in your wall, this is more an application-specific plug that can only be used for this one service. Like you would need an Apple network access in order to run an Apple TV. And yeah, so we actually had to spend a lot of time on that. At the end, I think we got it quite right with the definition. Then we entered the fourth version of Save the Internet when the whole thing went back to the Parliament for second reading. And then again, we did a final countdown version, and the law that we have in Europe right now is quite good, but it has a lot of ambiguity on a few points. So that's why we had to follow up at the regulatory implementation. So like in India and the US, at the end you have a telecom regulator, like the FCC in the US or TRAI in India, and they are actually the judges and the police when it comes to net neutrality. And in the US, it was only the FCC ever making rules for net neutrality. And here in Europe, suddenly, as the law opened up so many possibilities, again, the regulators had to step in to make detailed rules about what net neutrality means in practice. And so we did the sixth version for the campaign, and back then I was also traveling a lot to the capitals and speaking with the regulators, trying to explain net neutrality to them. And we also had a public consultation and asked for comments. And the first 100,000 comments we delivered to the offices of the body of the European regulators in Riga. And that was just the first 100,000. We then also had many protests in, again, Barcelona, Riga, Bonn, Brussels, and Vienna. And that was the point where the whole movement actually got a lot more widening. So we had many consumer protection organizations joining us, and many more companies also raising their voice. And then in the final push for the 7th version, we also for the first time had a fully translated campaign website. Because what's tricky for Europe is you cannot just have your information in English and believe that everyone will read it. You have 24 official languages, and that was the first time that we at least got 18 of those languages officially translated. And that was only possible because we had funding from a foundation. And language is a huge issue, also because you do not have one singular political debate in Europe. You have 28 national debates. There is not even one medium, one newspaper, or one comedian that could tell you a story which is reflected in all European countries. And so that is always an obstacle, and that's why we relied so much on national partners that would amplify our message on that level. So at the end, we managed to get almost 500,000 comments, which was really huge for the size of the budget and the many volunteer hours that went into that campaign. And if we dive deeper into the numbers, you can see that Germany had a huge share in the comments that were submitted to the regulators. And then, of course, the other big countries like the UK and France and Spain. But then there were also a few really small countries like Belgium, Denmark, and Austria. And there we had relatively a wider share because we had strong partners that could amplify the message in local media and were a voice for net neutrality. And that's the whole list of NGOs and companies that we had as coalition members at the end to get this success. And so we're actually also celebrating this. This is the team in Brussels. In those two pictures lay 3 years. And so where do we now stand with net neutrality? Europe is not in a vacuum in that regard, as you all know. And there are quite some similarities between the debate in the US, in Europe, and in India. In all three instances, it was a grassroots bottom-up movement that asked and called for these legal safeguards. And if we compare the rules between those three jurisdictions, we also see a lot of similarity between the US and Europe. You actually have very similar protections on blocking and throttling and trade prioritization, specialized service, and device freedom, the freedom to tether, but then really weak rules when it comes to zero rating and interconnection. And another unique thing is that also in Europe you have rules on the minimum, average and maximum bandwidth, so that you can also get out of your contract if you're not getting what you're paying for. And India, of course, originally only had rules on zero rating. That was the situation at the end of last year. But then, of course, Donald Trump came into office, appointed Ajit Pai as the new chairperson of the FCC, and the rules in the US are sadly right now history, but I hope that the US will be successful in regaining them either via a CRA or like the New York has now done. I think there are ways to reverse this wrong choice. And then, of course, India has also had some very interesting movement now, tries to propose new rules which would kind of complete the picture when it comes to net neutrality in India. And if those are actually put into force by the ministry, I think that India is now like the poster child for net neutrality in the world. And it's worth looking also at the text. I think they're quite inspirational. So coming back to the comparison, where does this leave us? So we have the US going down, we have India going up, and Europe is kind of in the crossroads because we have good laws that are similar to the Open Internet Order, but at the same time, we have a problem with enforcement. So again, there are similarities in most European countries. This is a national matter. Like in the US, you have an ex post regulation. So you have a telecom company violating net neutrality, and then hopefully the regulator steps in and does something about it. And the specialty is here that in most jurisdictions, the courts could also hold up decisions, so that in fact, like here in Germany, we have Stream On from Deutsche Telekom, you could have a violation that's clearly illegal, but it takes up to 2 or 3 years until it's actually out of the open internet. And in India, contrary, you have a really good system, is a kind of de facto ex ante system. A telecom company can always propose a new access product, but then within 7 days, the regulator looks at it, and if it finds it's in breach of the laws and the rules, then it can say, okay, you have to stop this now, and the worst case for the telecom operator is it could even lose its license, which is a really hard penalty and actually works quite well. So most of the telecom companies in India behave quite well to the rules. And of course, we are speaking of multi-billion multinational companies, so making them oblige the law is a tricky issue. we should look closer at the regulation, at those weird organizations that are tasked with enforcing net neutrality, how regulation works in general. You can really make it simple with the old story of the carrot and the stick. So a regulator can use the carrot, give the company what it wants, and have benefits for their business to make them behave. But sometimes the regulator also needs to use his stick. He needs to be able to punish the company, to use penalties or other things to make them behave. And usually, if you give the regulator a big enough stick, they never have to use it. But there are other problems. Revolving doors are a really intrinsic structural problem when it comes to telecom regulation. So you have a lot of interchange between the personnel of the industry and the regulators tasked with overseeing this industry. And the cool down periods are actually quite low often, so that people move in and out. And this problem is particularly strong in the bigger countries, like in France, in Germany, and in the UK, where you have governments which still hold shares for their former national telecom incumbent. And so if this company is directly benefiting to the budget of that country, the regulator that's part of the government will have a harder time actually doing something that's harmful to that company. So there is a kind of corporate influence there via the ministries. Lastly, of course, budget constraints are always a factor. Often regulators only have a limited budget for the cases they can pursue in court, and so they will only pick and choose the cases which they think they can win. And that, of course, is a strategic thing you have to be aware of, and sometimes also can use for your advantage if you build the right cases. So, to summarize, have we actually enforced net neutrality in Europe? And I'm going to go back to the list of the individual aspects of net neutrality to lay those out. But if we look at the various things that you would expect a regulator to do, we actually have a really mixed picture. So only 17% of the regulators have updated their website. This is according to an official study of the body of the European telecom regulators. And although the regulation applies to 31 countries, it's the EU28 plus the 3 EFTA countries. 2 haven't responded, therefore it's 29 countries in total. So just you don't want the statistics a little bit off here. So 17% of the countries have updated their website. That means if you are in one of the other 24 countries and you have a net neutrality violation, you find the right regulator to complain. There is no information on how to actually submit a net neutrality violation to them. Only one country, France, has created a dedicated complaint mechanism where you can submit a violation. And that, of course, that leads to a really mixed picture of how many violations they get. Really weirdly also, only half of the regulators offer their users speed tests. So before we said, you have a right as a consumer to get the bandwidth that's in your contract, not only the maximum up to, but also the minimum, the average, and the maximum. And of course, you would need some software in order to find out if you're getting what you're paying for. And in half of the countries, that is still a problem. Even more interestingly, only 17% of the regulators measure their network on the whole. So what does this mean? One of the conditions for specialized services is that they cannot eat away the bandwidth of the open internet. So you cannot start having, I don't know, a Facebook 3D reality specialized service that suddenly uses half of the bandwidth. That would be illegal in Europe, but most regulators are just looking away and not even measuring the current quality of the internet. And that is something they have to fix quite fast. And then again, it's a really weird European thing. We have 4 countries that have not established penalties for net neutrality. So in Portugal or Croatia, for example, if you are a big telecom company, you violate net neutrality, the worst thing is that can happen is they say you have to stop, but there will not be a fine for you. And that is because although it's a regulation, you would have to apply those, you would have to make those fines nationally. And let's play a little game. What do you think is the highest fine for violating net neutrality in Europe? It's actually really high. It's 3 million or 10% of the annual turnover. That's more than the GDPR. And what do you think is the lowest fine if you violate net neutrality?
0. You have to stop.
No, yeah, 0 is actually true, but for those that have laws on fines, it's Bulgaria, 250 euros. It actually historically makes a little bit of sense because they have around 3,000 community network operators in Bulgaria. But anyways, so now coming back to what I mentioned before, the different types of net neutrality violations. Have we enforced these things? On blocking and throttling, we see a mixed picture. Mostly it works. You don't see blocking that much, but you have instances of throttling. So particularly video traffic is often throttled to SD quality instead of HD quality. And that is a widespread problem that is not unifiedly tackled by the regulators. Paid prioritization, not really an issue. We are fine on that. Specialized services, we haven't seen big problems there. But with the launch of 5G, we'll see much more products and problems arising here, because with the technologies on 5G, like network slicing, you will see the telecom industry becoming creative and innovative with new services that are kind of these no longer universal plugs and vertically integrated services. So specialized services will, I guess, become a problem, and that's why BEREC, the European Regulator Association, will launch a consultation this year exactly about this issue. Device freedom, that's really one of the problems that we've solved completely. This used to be a huge problem in Eastern Europe. What is device freedom? The operator cannot tell you that you cannot use the internet on your phone, also on your laptop, for example, or that you are limited to if you want to have Wi-Fi, you have to pay extra and stuff like that. This is illegal. So every internet you get, you can use on every device, and we are more or less safe on that front. Then the minimum, average, and maximum speed, that is still a half-baked thing. So like only 48% of the countries have these rules actually implemented, so that at least in the contract you know what your average bandwidth should be. And even in those other half of the countries that have those rules, it's hard to enforce them, like in Germany, for example. I was actually earlier today, I was in the German Economic Ministry and speaking with them about this problem, because in Germany there was recently a study that 95% of the customers of the incumbent here don't get the speeds that they are paying for. And particularly in rural areas, this is a huge problem. Interconnection is really tricky. Interconnection means that's the point where data is exchanged between the networks of ISPs. And I would like to tell you more about that, but it's really hard for civil society actors to get a clear picture, because usually you don't have end-user involvement. It's only companies and internet providers and exchange hub operators that know the real picture, and we mostly rely on leaks from them to identify problems. And then, of course, there's the elephant in the room. Zero rating, we really have the biggest problems. Zero rating is keeping us busy at night. Why is that? In 86% of the countries in Europe, you have zero rating offers. So this is a really widespread problem. And in most of the countries which don't have zero rating, it's because they don't have volume caps anymore, which is the best solution to their problem. But of those 25 countries, if we zoom in there is where you have the problem of zero rating. Actually, only 11 of those countries have launched a formal investigation and assessment of those products. And how many do you think have actually prohibited one type of zero rating or another? It's zero. The same number as in the US. This case-by-case rule on zero rating has never worked. There's a case in Canada where it has worked, but that's the only one to my knowledge. And so wherever you don't have bright line rules that tell you economic discrimination is prohibited, making some data packages more expensive than others is prohibited, everywhere we have those problems. And that, of course, makes you wonder how the rules should be, and why don't we have this first initial case that helps us actually make sure that the rules are enforced. And this is not for a lack of trying from the telecom industry. You might all know this offer from Portugal. I think it went viral in December around the FCC vote. This is an offer from the Portuguese incumbent Meo, and their SmartNet product is really coming close to the early dystopian visions of net neutrality. And Portugal is really the country with the worst net neutrality situation right now. And again, this is the company that used to be government-owned, and therefore it is even harder for the regulator to act in favor. And so that's why what we often hear also from other regulators is that we have to bring up cases against such offers, because those are really blatant violations of the principle of net neutrality. And that's why we also have partnered up with our colleagues from the NGO D3 in Portugal, and will now bring a case against this offer. But there are also more trickier parts. So we have a new type of net neutrality violation. If you look through the history, net neutrality violations have changed over time. And the first offer of that type was binge on from T-Mobile. I always call them open class-based zero rating offers, because they appear to be non-discriminatory. Because in theory, every music or video streaming operator can just sign up to be part of that product. And we have seen this model of net neutrality violation really proliferate. Deutsche Telekom T-Mobile has launched it in almost all of their subsidiaries here in Europe. Vodafone Pass is now the Vodafone offer, which is really similar, and is launched in 8 countries. And then you also have Telekom Austria Free Stream, which kind of is the last in the game. And so really, T-Mobile, Deutsche Telekom is the most innovative telecom operator when it comes to violating net neutrality. And that was also more or less my message when I spoke last year at the annual shareholder conference in Bonn, in front of the Deutsche Telekom headquarter. And my basic message there was that it is much like what Deutsche Telekom is doing is more or less burning down the forest, which fruits creates the demand for their access products, because they are really cutting into the innovative capacity of the internet when they make the companies that create the demand for their products signing up and entering into contracts with them. And then we, of course, wrote several analyses of these products and then submitted complaints to the German regulators. And this case now at least has passed the regulator. After 8 months of considerations, they have at least decided to prohibit the technical discrimination, the throttling and the roaming prohibitions in that product. But we haven't won on zero rating, which is a problem. And although this is only a half-baked decision, it will probably be held up in court for at least 1 up to 2 years, which means that this violation is still out there in the internet. A more optimistic case, in 2016, right after the regulation went into force, we submitted a complaint against Hutchinson 3 in Austria. They had 9 zero rating offers that also included technical discrimination. When I speak of throttling in the context of zero rating, I mean something like this. So you have the green graph, which is the in-house television service of this telecom operator, and then you have the purple graph, which is the public broadcaster in Austria. And the point where you see the change is when the data volume is exceeded. So the internet is cut off, but my own service still goes on. And this is a clear type of technical violation wrapped up in a zero rating offer. And those are actually quite easy to win. Except one case in Italy, we have succeeded to get those out of the market. And why I'm mentioning this is because there's always a positive side effect. Whenever zero rating is prohibited, the data volumes go up, and sometimes even the prices go down. We have seen this in the Netherlands, in Slovenia, and also here in Austria, where you had a up to 70 times increase of the gigabytes offered and 32% decline in the prices. So that actually was also really good, and it makes sense. When you no longer can give yourself special treatment and a benefit, then you have to increase the data volumes for everyone else, because how else should you offer then your television services? Now we have to zoom into Vodafone Pass. This type of violation is, again, it's a group strategy. This is rolled out in almost all subsidies of Vodafone, and they're trying to really circumvent the open internet. How does it work? You have 4 passes that you have to pay for, and then you get zero rating social or chat or video or music offers. And you have those 4 arbitrary categories that also cut between existing services. For example, Facebook is in the social category, Facebook Messenger is in the chat category. And you have to pay now 2 times €5 in order to use both. And it's really telecom operators changing the level playing field and chopping up the internet into individual blocks and then marketing it off. And even those 4 categories are not unique. In Romania, the social and chat category are actually one and called social, but you have a maps category, which includes Google Maps and Apple Maps. Particularly for this audience, I want to mention 2 more things before I close. One, this is BitLove is one of our partners. They have come to us. They are a podcast hosting service. And they actually rely on BitTorrent technology to host their podcasts. And they are really a popular demand thing for many of the small podcasters, because when you run a small podcast and you have a small server and suddenly you really have an interesting episode, your server goes down under the peak of so many users at once. But BitTorrent is a perfect solution to that problem, because if there is many users wanting one file, that's when BitTorrent works best. And so BitLove created a BitTorrent-based podcast hosting service, and they are really well known here in the German podcast scene. But there is a problem. These types of open class-based zero-rating offers rely on identification of the service in order to count them differently, in order to exclude them from the monthly data volume. But a decentralized service cannot be identified. And that means this type of new internet that they are offering us is actually excluding all forms of decentralized protocols and services, and they are also relying on a legal entity. They need somebody that enters into the legal contract in that country, in that language, in order to be part of the zero-rating offer, which particularly in the European digital single market with 28 countries and 24 languages is a huge problem. So from the thousands of ISPs in Europe, you would have to enter into many, many different contracts in order to be on equal footing with the big internet companies. And then, of course, this is not a sign up once and then don't worry later. You have liability. If you're a small startup and you enter into such a zero-rating contract, then you constantly have to keep them up to date. Before you change your own service, you have to give them 1 month notice, because you are liable for any wrongfully billed data volume. And that's not the worst part of these new types of net neutrality violations. Let's talk about privacy, because all those products heavily rely on deep packet inspection. And deep packet inspection is prohibited here in Europe. That was part of the net neutrality regulation. And so just briefly, you all probably know how the internet is built. It's like in layers. There is the OSI model to your right. And if you look at the OSI model, the definition of deep packet inspection is quite simple. The payload of transport layer 4 is off hands. An ISP may not look into any of the upper layers, so it cannot really look at the real content of the user, for example, the URLs that you're accessing. And what do you think how a service can identify its content? Via URLs and SNI. So you're actually relying on characteristics of the service you use, which are really close to user behavior. Now comes the final thing. Consumer protection law obliges a telecom company to retain all billing data. Think like if you have your monthly bill from your mobile operator and you think this bill is off, you can request your call records. Now, if you have a wrongful bill because your gigabytes were off, you can also request the billing data, but this would now include all the URLs which you have accessed. And this is kind of data retention through the back door, and another of the many problems that we see with these new types of net neutrality violations. Finally, again, speaking to also a partly technical audience, one of the things that we came up with actually quite early was respectmynet.eu. That is a platform for crowdsourcing net neutrality violations. If you come across something that you think is not in line with the open internet principles, you can submit the case here. And right now, it's only that. It's a public blaming and shaming platform for net neutrality violations. But our hope would actually be to develop this further into a really enforcement tool, so that you cannot just say, this is a violation and maybe it's off, but also, okay, submit this now to the regulator, submit this now to the Telecom Council or to the ministry or any local NGO. Because if the regulators are not telling the users how to complain, we as a society have to do it. And I think it's one of the things that we have to think about, because we are not done with net neutrality once we have regulatory or legal safeguards. We also have to make sure that the telecom operators are doing their job. And that brings me to the conclusion to sum up. Europe is at a crossroads here. We have very interesting years ahead. The net neutrality regulation will be looked at by the European Commission. They have to publish a report by April of 2019. So then they have to officially tell what their opinion is, whether we have to reform this law or whether we have to reform the regulatory implementations. And so we need the practical experience of the enforcement, not only for the political process, but also because we have to deliver net neutrality to the people. We have to really be able to kick those net neutrality violations off the network, because only then will net neutrality be really delivered to the people and to the innovation. Thank you.
Now, we're going to do a little Q&A in a little comfy chair situation. So Thomas, thank you so much. Thank you. Everyone applauded as well. So I think we'll start in the room. Just a reminder, we will take questions online in IRC, Air Mozilla, and Slack. It's speaker-series. So let's start in the room. Anyone? I see a hand. We have a microphone so folks can hear.
Can you just shortly explain zero rating?
Yes. Sorry for completely forgetting to explain that concept. Zero rating is the practice of excluding certain applications from your monthly data volume. So it means that you have, for example, 2 gigabytes of mobile data that you can use for every application, but then when you use Facebook, it doesn't count towards those 2 gigabytes. That would be a practical example. And what it does, it makes the use of certain applications cheaper than anything else, or put it otherwise, the rest of the internet is more expensive, but a few services are sponsored or subsidized.
All right. We have one question from Slack. So you shared quite a lot of alarming, disturbing, maybe concerning information. So the question is, what keeps you motivated? Why do we have hope?
I mean, you have to know where we started off. We thought that net neutrality is not just a good idea, it ought to be the law, and that was a quite surreal and optimistic idea. And the fact that we now have these legal protections is already something that is a really positive thing, I think. And now it's, I also feel a kind of obligation, because these legal safeguards are really quite good if you apply them right. And so I see now all the violations and the creativity of the industry to circumvent those rules. And it's the same level of creativity and motivation that I want to push back against that. And also, just from a long-term perspective, there are so many things in the digital rights world which are very hard problems. For example, privacy will need years to solve the surveillance problem, and all those economic interests that are undermining our privacy. Then on copyright, we would have to go hundreds of years back in order to reform copyright and make it just and up to date for modern age. Net neutrality, to the contrary, is just such a simple problem. It came up in our generation, and I also believe really that we can solve it in our generation. And that would mean we would have one thing off our bucket, you know, and wouldn't that be great?
Mm-hmm. All right, generation, listen up. That's right. Who else? Folks are, there's one.
You just mentioned generation. How do I explain this problem to older generations, like my parents? How do I explain to them why net neutrality, or why enforcing net neutrality is important, and why it's not a good thing to buy a pass to use Google Maps on your phone for free?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I also often struggle with making it simple. Burger King recently had this video that came out yesterday that is a really good explanation of the basic principle of net neutrality, and also the fact that a company like Burger King feels comfortable speaking out on such a political issue shows you how far ahead we are now in the American debate. And here in Europe, of course, we have not really, net neutrality hasn't sunk in that deep in society. We don't have this level of so enrounding where librarians and people on the train know what net neutrality is. But, and particularly if you are not grown up with the internet, it's difficult to explain the difference between telephony and television to the internet. But I think it is the also just showing your grandparents the fact of this innovative capacity that they will experience, at least if they use Skype to talk with their children and their grandchildren, then I think they already know what the internet is capable of, and explaining it thereby. This would not have been possible if the telecom company could make a license and get a fee for every service. And probably also the global nature could be a way of explaining it. I'm good at explaining it to children. I haven't really succeeded probably with older people. I should work on that.
Okay, so folks have opened up online. So we have a question specifically, so clearly like there's a lot that you've learned in the EU. What can we in the United States learn from the challenges you faced?
It's really a tricky one because I think particularly what we hopefully will succeed in the coming months and years is this getting the regulators to really act on the safeguards, to really kick them and push them to do their job. Because this is something that I, at least from what I gathered, was also a problem in the US. So the FCC was not particularly keen on actually doing something with the net neutrality protections. And of course, India would be a better example to learn than Europe in that regard, but it's a big step away from where we are right now. And otherwise, I don't know if you can send faxes to Congress, but maybe that would also be a good idea.
All right. We have another one. So we know that today's policymakers did not grow up with the internet as it is today. So how can we help them, the policymakers, understand the concept of digital rights and how important it is for people now and in the future?
I often, like, with conservative people in particular, I often use competition arguments to explaining net neutrality. And that actually works quite well. It's also one of the things that I like about the issue, that you can really reach to the same conclusions by a very left or a very right narrative. So you can either speak about universal access and equal rating, equal opportunities, or you can speak about competition, you can speak about innovative capacities. You can tell them, particularly here in Europe, if we go away from net neutrality, who would be able to afford the specialized access? It would be the current incumbents, the big Silicon Valley internet companies, and making them understand this bottom-up innovative capacity is the only way that European SMEs could be the challenges, and therefore it's also a little bit an economic protectional argument that you can actually use. So that's another thing that works quite well with conservatives.
Great, thank you. Other questions in the room? Someone right there.
I was wondering, who's your enemy and how do you fight? Fight on the policy front and trying to achieve something with the regulators? Have you thought about also fighting or doing something directly with the companies, with the internet providers, against the big ones, or finding allies in the small ones?
Exactly right, and we've tried both. So actually many of the smaller ISPs are supporters of net neutrality because they also realize all these types of violations are not really to their benefit, because you would need a large customer base in order to ask for paid prioritization, for example, or benefit from these open zero rating offers. And I often, like in a public forum, I'm always up for a confrontational discussion with telecom operators, and I actually find it a very uplifting intellectual exercise. And you've seen me at the annual shareholder meeting of Deutsche Telekom. That was one example to at least speak with the board of that company, and actually one of the board members later approached me and wanted to talk. But I am also hesitant to talk too much with the industry behind closed doors. I feel like we should have these discussions, but I would always like to have a camera there, and I would want those arguments up in front, because telecom operators are quite good at lobbying, but only if there is nobody else to challenge their point of view. And so I'm always looking for opportunities to have this, at the end, political discussion about net neutrality up and out in the open.
What are the arguments that actually work? Or did you find any arguments that actually work, or do the operators find convincing in a way? Like, how do you approach convincing them? Not just confronting them because it's good for the people and you should change your practice, but they going to react to something that is to their benefits. Are there any kind of tactics?
So the general argumentational line that the telecom industry has used, to my knowledge, is they are often trying to compare the internet with previous communication systems or transport systems, for example. But there are these roads in Italy where you have a fast track that costs more, and wouldn't it be bad if we use the same innovative business model also for the internet? Or we have done in telephony something like calling party network pays, where we get money if we terminate a call. So if I call you, your operator actually gets money from my operator, and we want only the old thing, you know? Why not have the old business model in the new world? That's more or less the argumentational line. And then you have to more or less explain how the internet works, and that it's a bidirectional network, and that I'm not just paying for the... My car is not just paying the operator of the roads that I'm driving on, but my car, as my service, has to pay for the roads that the customers that want to reach my service use. And so that it actually doesn't work the same way, you know, that we don't have the packet switched end-to-end best effort network is something other than telephony. And that's the basic thing they have to understand. If you can make that point, usually they don't have much more arguments.
Okay. Any other in-room questions? Also, the other offices, in case that wasn't clear, you should have a microphone. So I know we've taken some of your questions through Slack, and that's fine. But if you want to ask in the office, that's fine. Anyone else in... we have one more here.
So you mentioned repeatedly that regulatory incentive is kind of damaged by state involvement or state ownership in telcos. But on the other hand, one would think that state ownership or investment in telcos would actually increase leverage for actual regulation. What are the strategies for turning this into an advantage, maybe?
What do you mean? So that the influence that the government, in theory, could have over the company via shares?
Correct.
The problem is, and that's exactly what my point was at the telecom shareholder conference, that most of the economics people believe that, yeah, okay, violating net neutrality is bad for everyone else, but it's good for us. And so, and I haven't come across a government that has the idealistical motivation to really say, no, but we are for net neutrality, and therefore we order our partly owned telecom company not to violate it. Probably the Dutch government would be the only one so pro net neutrality that they would make this stance out of idealistic reasons. But if you look at a pure economic perspective, for short-term gain, of course the telecom company could profit if it gets a little bit of the cake of all the money that somebody else is making via their pipes with their customers. But if you factor in all the costs for society at large, the innovation and your own economy, then it makes no more sense. But this second step, I at least haven't succeeded in bringing any ministry or government to do. But I'm happy to try.
Please do. Okay, it's a little quiet online. We don't have any more online questions. Anybody else in the room? I see another hand.
Thank you. Hey, I have a German-specific question, I think. So in Germany, we're pretty much stuck with 3 mobile operators these days, and I don't think there's any way out. It doesn't look like we're opening up licenses to anyone else, and it feels like we've been stuck for years and fallen behind like a lot of other European countries. How could we tackle this? Like, if one of the penalties is like losing a license, but we won't give it to someone else, then we have just 2 companies left. That doesn't look like something that would work. Like, how can we actually get unblocked on this?
Yeah, actually, if you only look around to the neighboring countries, you see that there are many really good ways to, and Europe actually has a huge success story in that regard, forcing competition into the telecom market. Because the telecom market, think about it, it's such a huge cost to build a network. And some people call it a national monopoly. Because if you are not Hutchinson and have billions and billions of Chinese mining money, it's really hard to start your own network in a country. But you don't need the physical infrastructure in order to be a competitor. So there are things like mobile virtual network operators. Kongstar is one example, is a subsidy of Deutsche Telekom, and you have many of these virtual operators that use the same physical infrastructure, but that are a separate company and that can run their own logical network, and they can really force prices down. And in Germany, what the economic ministry should do, and that is also something that might be good to mention in the current ongoing government negotiations, would be to force them big operators to have like 20-25% of their capacity sold to virtual operators. And if there is a company that like, you would have to regulate the price, but then you would have a certain amount of gigabyte minutes and voices that are just auctioned off. And then you could have competition bottom up without actually having to invest in a network. We have done that for since the 90s in the fixed line market, and many other European countries are also doing it in the mobile market, and that would be the solution for Germany. But again, the other big problem is Germany is really not investing into infrastructure, and so both the streets and also the pipes for internet are really small and under capacity in Germany. And what the government should do is also to invest a few billions into fiber network, and Germany would have the money to do that actually.
All right. Anyone else in Berlin? I see a hand.
Hi. Why are Nordic countries doing so well in this? For example, in Finland, we have no data caps at all.
It's a really good question, and because there are so few problems with net neutrality, those countries are not in my focus. We should really talk with somebody from Finland, because they are the poster child when it comes to all these things.
He just asked the question.
Great. So I've spoken a lot with the Swedish regulator PTS, because they were one of our fiercest enemies on net neutrality. But I think one of the reasons is because they have structural separation. So in many of these Nordic countries, the company that offers you internet access service is not the same company that owns the infrastructure. And you also have similar products in the US, like community broadband networks often function in a similar way, that they are either structurally or functionally separated. And it's actually quite good if you think about it, because the internet infrastructure is such a vital part of our information society that it intrinsically is too big to fail. And a company that has millions of customers and might have some decline or ups and downs in revenue, is probably not the best place to localize this infrastructure. And so, again, having a virtual system would be actually a really good way forward. And then also you could maybe keep this local infrastructure in local public hands, like in a municipality or in a country, and not really on a too big of an organizational structure.
Okay, the pressure's off, Berlin. We will get to you. We actually have another one in Slack, and then we'll get to you, Solana. So speaking of infrastructure, you were coming up with some kind of creative scenarios. This is really on the technology side. Do you think it's possible to fix net neutralities with technology, for example, making the internet itself decentralized using encryption and P2P networks? And as you described, do you think that's the way to go?
I think this is definitely something worth looking into and also developing further. My problem or my hesitation when it comes to technological solutions to policy questions is always that I fear how many people we leave behind who would not adapt into this new decentralized, completely encrypted other internet that I'm sure we have to build, because it would also solve many other problems. But at least speaking from a political perspective, we have to aim for a solution that is solving the problem for the majority of people. And the problem is also then the access to these decentralized systems would definitely not be zero-rated, at least not by T-Mobile. And so you still need to at least give some form of local access. Networks are always a local thing. And if you then can connect to something completely encrypted and decentralized, which completely excludes the possibility for this level of control, that would be great. But the first link, the last mile, still needs to be neutral in order to allow access to everyone.
Yeah. Solana.
Hi. I'm curious how you found the media industry. Have they been an ally, both public media, commercial media? They're so concerned about gatekeepers and who can keep people from their content, or, yeah, I'm curious how, both in terms of coverage, but also in terms of where they fall on this issue.
So actually, particularly the German Newspaper Association was a huge ally for us, and they're also a strong force here in Germany. And also public broadcasters, both on a European level and from various countries, have been really big allies in the political fight. Then the Media Regulatory Authority, so media diversity, is something that also ties into net neutrality, and there we also found good allies. And it's exactly the same argumentation. So they all are afraid of too much centralization, and they fear about diversity, and so they are more inclined for decentralization and open access. And when it comes to coverage, to the second part of your question, we were always at a big disadvantage because European issues seem very far away to a national political audience. So Europe is usually covered with the foreign policy section and not within the domestic policy section. And in fact, we got far more coverage about the recent FCC decision here in Europe than about all of the European net neutrality debates. And we were really in an uphill battle most of the time to get the media to coverage the votes in the European legislative process, because most of them only report after Europe has made a decision.
All right, we have time for one more question.
I'll ask another one.
Okay, one more from Solana.
I was struck when you were giving your presentation how you were showing round 1, round 2, round 3, and it went all the way up to 7 rounds. I'm just curious, in terms of activism, how do you, were those stages something that you planned ahead for, or were you just living from day to day with those changes and those reiterations, like now's the vote, now's this stage? Is that something you have to plan for whenever you work on European politics?
Did I know what I got into when I started this 2013? No. Like almost all of these stages were created out of necessity, because we were faced with political obstacles and we had to find the means to to fight this and to make people aware, first of all, what's happening, and then give them tools to make their voices heard. That was always the motivation. And we adapted. Each of these stages is different. And by the way, each of these iterations of Safety Internet is up on GitHub. You can find it, and there's also now an archive page. We wanted also to create tools. For example, the fax tool was open source, and all of these things we created along the way and wanted to be as public as possible. And sadly, it is only possible to make it, at least from all the ways that I have succeeded in creating such a campaign, was out of necessity. It would be really good if we would think ahead, if we would have the resources to build a campaigning framework that is reusable and easier to adopt than all these things that we wrote once. And but that is, yeah, maybe we still need other structures to create those tools. I mean, I can imagine the whole fax idea was in one of the meetings that we had really early on, and somebody just said, well, wouldn't it be cool to send faxes? Yeah, but why not? And so, no, there was no master plan. Except the thing with the comments, of course. We had the US and India as a comparison point. And if you think about it, India has 1 billion citizens, EU as a whole has 500 million citizens. They had 1 million comments. At least we made it on par with almost 500,000, so I'm proud of it.
Well, speaking of faxes, a reminder, if you are in the US, and hey, if you're in the EU, maybe it's a good idea to build your version, but there is a service, thank you, Larissa, for reminding me, called ResistBot. And ResistBot is a super easy mobile app that lets you actually mail a letter or send a fax to your representative in the government. So I'm not sure if an EU example exists, but it might be something nice to look at. And if you're in the US, ResistBot. Thomas, thank you so much. And with that, we will wrap.